Hello, I'm Nikki Going and I'm recording this presentation on behalf of Enhanced Language Services or ELS. This presentation is on Poem of Return by the Angolan poet Jofre Rocha. This is a protest poem and it can also be seen as an elegy. It is set in colonized Angola. Please note it's not a South African protest poem and it does not reference apartheid. Poem of Return is one of the 12 NSC poems in the matric literature curriculum. And as with the other poems, although I have no way of knowing what poems will appear in the matric final exam, it's worth noting that every literature exam for the last 20 years has included at least 2 poems by African authors. I hope that you enjoy this presentation and that you find it useful. Please note that you will not be examined on historical details or on specific information relating to the poet. However, it's always useful to understand the context and environment in which a poet was writing, because then you can make sense of the poet's themes, remember those are the topics he focuses on, and message, the main points that he wants to make. Also, please note that Jofre Rocha is not a South African poet. As I said earlier, he did not live through apartheid. He didn't write about apartheid. If you look at the map, you can see where Angola is. It's the orange country north of Namibia, which is indicated in pink, on the western coast of southern Africa, and a long way away from South Africa, a few thousand kilometers. So remember, please, that Rocha was an Angolan poet, writer, lawyer, freedom fighter, journalist, and a member of Angola's post-colonial government. He grew up in Angola while Angola was colonized by the Portuguese and before it became independent. And although Angolans had been captured and used as slaves for hundreds of years, slavery had ended before Jofre's lifetime. There was no slavery in Angola during Jofre's lifetime, but Angolans were treated as second-class citizens under Portuguese rule, and they desperately wanted independence. Although Jofre Rocha was christened Roberto Antonio Victor Francisco de Almeida at birth, when he started writing protest poetry and fighting for Angola's freedom, he used what was known as a war name, which was Jofre Rocha. And he also used Jofre Rocha as his pseudonym in all of his writing. So some background information on Rocha. He was born in Angola, as I said, in 1941 in the rural area of Kashikana, which is not how you would spell it in English. You can see the spelling there, when Angola was still colonized by Portugal. His family then moved to Luanda, the capital city, because of unrest in the rural areas. When Rocha and his family were in Luanda, Rocha decided to join the MPLA, which is an Angolan resistance movement, so that he could participate in the fight for Angola's independence from Portuguese rule. The MPLA fought against the Portuguese army from 1961 to 1974, so it was a 13-year, very bloody, violent war. And the Angolan freedom fighters relied very heavily on what's known as guerrilla warfare. So they didn't operate in formal armies with formal uniforms and platoons. They would emerge from the rural areas, from the veldt, to attack the Portuguese soldiers and then go back into hiding. And the civilian population, those that weren't part of the Portuguese army or the Angolan resistance movements, were caught between 3 different groups of freedom fighters who were also sometimes fighting with each other, and the Portuguese army. And as a result, during that war, there was forced labor, massacres, massive displacements of hundreds of thousands of people, and terrible atrocities were committed by all parties involved. And that violence continued in an even bloodier civil war that followed independence, which Angola eventually gained in 1975. And you can see in that picture on the right, that's a historical photo of Portuguese army forces in Angola, and they're walking along through the thick Angolan bush looking for resistance fighters. So some information about Rocha in general. Rocha fought as both a freedom fighter and in his role as a writer. He wrote several volumes of poetry, mostly in Portuguese, and some of those were translated into English. His writing focused on the social and economic consequences of the war and of independence, and the personal impact that these events had on him. In 1961, Rocha left Angola for Lisbon in Portugal, and while he was in Portugal, he was imprisoned by the Portuguese dictatorship that governed Portugal. And they imprisoned him because of his political activism and his fighting for freedom in their colony of Angola. As a result, he spent months in the notorious Aljube prison in Lisbon, which is the capital of Portugal, before he returned to Luanda in Angola. Once he was back in Angola, he was imprisoned again for a total of 18 months by the Portuguese colonial government, and that happened during the period that led up to independence. And again, he was imprisoned because he was a member of the MPLA and he was fighting for Angolan independence. When Angola did gain its independence in 1975, the MPLA won the elections and Rocha became a member of the Angolan government. He had various roles in the Angolan government from 1976 until 2008. So he wasn't only a poet. In fact, poetry was one of the things that he seemed to do in his spare time. The pictures on the slide might give you a starting point as you jot down some ideas of how you would define a hero. So think about the connotations of the word hero, the social, cultural, and emotional meanings of the word, not just a dictionary definition. And I would suggest that at this point you stop the video, write down as many ideas as you can think of, and then as we go through the poem, see how many of your ideas match up with those of Jofre Rocha's. Again, I would suggest that you stop the video once I finish talking and you jot down some more ideas. And these pictures might give you a starting point. So I would like you please to think about what a hero's welcome would traditionally look and feel like. So if you were returning home after being away, particularly after being away somewhere dangerous and isolated and after a long time, how would you expect or like to be welcomed back after that dangerous journey? And also, how do you think you would feel when you get back? So those pictures are just to give you some ideas. Please stop the video, write down your ideas. I'm just going to give you some background on the poem itself. Rocha had left Angola for Portugal, as we said, and while he was away, the War of Liberation continued. When Rocha returned after his time in prison in Lisbon, he didn't want a hero's welcome, which might strike you as odd if you think about all the things that you thought about and said about a hero's welcome in your notes. And the reason that he didn't want a hero's welcome is probably because he actually was experiencing a form of survivor's guilt. He felt that the real heroes were his comrades who had stayed and fought and had never been away from their community as he had. And even though those that stayed had suffered from terrible traumas as a result of the war, Jofre paradoxically mourns the fact that he missed out on those experiences while he was away. And the implication is that he feels some guilt, as I said, and he also feels that he missed his comrades and that the loneliness of his exile was actually more painful for him than shared suffering in Angola would have been. And then just to give you some background, the pictures show a Portuguese soldier in a helicopter. Obviously, helicopters were a great way to move around the rural areas of Angola, which were often covered with thick bush, and the Portuguese army had a big advantage because they had helicopters and they could afford them. The flag at the bottom is the Angolan flag, and it's the flag that Angola still has today, now that it has gained independence. I'm now going to read the poem to you. As I read it, listen carefully to the way that it sounds. Remember that poems are written to be heard rather than to be read silently. And as I read, listen out for the phonic or sound devices of rhyme, rhythm, alliteration, assonance, and onomatopoeia, and think about why the poet has used those devices and the effects that he achieves. Poem of Return, Jofre Rocha. When I return from the land of exile and silence, do not bring me flowers. Bring me rather all the dews, tears of dawns which witness dramas. Bring me the immense hunger for love and the plaintive tumid sexes in the star-studded night. Bring me the long night of sleeplessness with mothers mourning, their arms bereft of sons. When I return from the land of exile and silence, no, do not bring me flowers. Bring me only just this, the last wish of heroes fallen at daybreak, with a wingless stone in hand and a thread of anger snaking from their eyes. As I analyze the poem, I suggest that you take notes, highlight key phrases, and also make sure that you understand the technical language terms and vocabulary that I use. I will remind you what these terms mean as I use them, and I suggest that you write down any definitions that you didn't already know. This is because it's very difficult to analyze literature and poetry if you cannot use the correct vocabulary. And ideally, I would be working on a printed copy of the poem so that you can take notes as you go along. And obviously, if you need to rewind and go over something or stop the video at any point, you can always do that. Poem of Return, Jofre, Rocha. When I return from the land of exile and silence, do not bring me flowers. I'm going to analyze the title and lines 1 and 2. And as I do, it might be an idea for you to look at the picture in the slide and think about it, what it makes you think about. Remember that Jofre wrote this poem while he was in exile from Angola. He'd gone into exile because the Portuguese Angolan government wanted to punish him for being a member of the MPLA, which was the Angolan resistance movement, and for fighting for Angolan independence. While he was in exile, he thought about his return to Angola. And he starts these lines with when, which means that he's making a statement. He's giving an indicative sentence, saying that coming back to Angola is a fact, not a possibility. He does not use a subjunctive mood, which would start with if. He describes the country as being forced into exile. Remember that going into exile means that you've been forced out of the country of your birth by the government, as being a place of exile and silence. Exile and silence both have implications of isolation, loneliness, and unhappiness. And the word silence implies both that Rocha had no one to talk to and that his freedom of speech had been limited by the Angolan government. He was not allowed to publish his poetry. He had been silenced because it was protest poetry. He worries that when he returns, his comrades will want to celebrate his return. And remember that flowers are often given to celebrate people's achievements or to welcome them home. In line 2, do not bring me flowers, Jofre surprisingly implies that he doesn't want his return to be celebrated with flowers. As he's been very unhappy in exile, it seems odd that he doesn't want to celebrate coming home from exile. You'll also notice that I spoke about line 1 being a statement. Okay, and this highlights the fact that both that Jofre is certain that he's going to return and that he is absolutely certain that he doesn't want his return celebrated with flowers. Remember that the 4 moods of the verb are indicative, where you make a statement, subjunctive, where you suggest a wish or a possibility, and often subjunctive sentences start with if, interrogative, when you ask a question, and imperative, when you give an order or a command. So you can actually read do not bring me flowers as imperative. He's giving a command. And you might be wondering, well, why do I need to know these things? It's very, very useful to know the 4 moods of the verb when you are discussing literature or answering questions in the language paper. Bring me rather all the dews, tears of dawns which witness dramas. In lines 3 and 4, Rocha paradoxically says that instead of celebratory flowers, he would rather be given dews or tears of dawns which have witnessed dramas. Here, dawn, which is the time when the sun rises in the early morning, is personified and seems to be a kind of a mother figure who's weeping. and her tears are the dew, those early morning drops of water that you find on the ground. So the dawn is described as crying tears of dew as it witnesses what is implied as her children, the Angolans, waking up to a new day that's full of painful dramas that happen as they wake up. So their whole day is packed with pain and dramas. And the use of the words all for dews and tears, and the fact that dews, tears, dawns, and dramas are all plurals, implies that there have been many traumatic mornings and that there will be many more. It also implies that Rocha regrets having missed any of them, and he doesn't want to miss any of them. The dramas that Rocha refers to here could imply the general recognition of the pain that Angolans wake up to every morning when they realize that their family members are missing, dead, or endangered because they have been part of those fights against the colonial government. Or it could refer perhaps to the fact that when governments want to arrest or intimidate their opposition, I'm talking about tyrannical dictatorships, they often choose to arrest people in the early hours of dawn. Because if you think about it, that's when people are fast asleep, they're at their most vulnerable. And if you kick someone's door down when they're fast asleep at 4 in the morning, you really amp up the psychological trauma and stress. Notice that throughout the poem, Rocha uses nature imagery, and he describes the Angolan landscape as watching, as a witness to the pain of the Angolan people. That's an important extended metaphor because it implies that the Angolan people and their land belong to one another, that they are inseparable, that they are meant to be together. And of course, it also emphasizes the opposite, the idea that the Portuguese colonialists are unwelcome outsiders, foreigners, who are trying to force their way between Angolans and the land that loves them. These lines 1 and 2 lines 3 and 4, like 1 and 2, form a single sentence which is split over 2 lines by enjambment. Remember, enjambment is when you take a sentence and you split it over a number of lines. So notice how that slows the rhythm of the sentence right down. And that sentence already had a slow rhythm because of the long vowel sounds in rather, dawns, and dramas, and the slight pause that is created by the line break at the word dews, which slows it down still further. Remember that when you discuss a phonetic or sound technique, you have to identify it, as I've just done, and then discuss the effect of it. So here, that very slow rhythm heightens the impression that Angolans have been suffering for a very, very long time. And wanting pain instead of flowers seems very illogical and contradictory. So Rocha's desire is paradoxical. But as the poem continues, he explains why this desire actually makes sense. Bring me the immense hunger for love and the plaint of tumid sexes in star-studded night. You would have noticed that lines 5 and 6 are also written in the imperative mood. As Rocha is issuing a command, he's absolutely certain that this is what he wants. And again, he's been paradoxical. He says that he would prefer to receive enormous emotional pain rather than celebratory flowers. In these lines, he says that he wants to be given or brought an immense, which means huge, hunger for love, along with the plaint of tumid sexes. A plaint is quite an archaic word for a complaint or a song of mourning. Another word for that is a lamentation. And tumid means swollen. So very surprisingly here, and rather unpoetically, you might think, Rocha says that he wants to be given loneliness, longing for love, and frustrated sexual desire. Because remember that if sexes are tumid, it implies that people are sexually unsatisfied and have an unsatisfiable, raging sexual desire. So this line highlights how many Angolans were separated from their romantic and sexual partners by the war for independence. They would spend night after night that ordinarily would have been the perfect setting for romance. You know, imagine star-studded nights. And they would be separated from their partners either by death or distance. Because they had been forced apart, they were unable to satisfy their sexual desires for each other. So again, you've got the sense of the landscape watching the suffering of the Angolan people. The beautiful star-studded night sky is a silent, helpless witness to their suffering. And notice how Rocha alliterates the S in sexes, star and studded. And you might be interested to know that the alliteration of S sounds is called sibilance. And it makes a kind of hissing, whispering sound, which highlights that sense of silent, quiet, interior suffering. Remember that archaic English, as I said earlier, is English that is quite old-fashioned and not in common use anymore. So you might find your grandparents at a push using the word plaint, and even they wouldn't use the word plaint very often. It's a much older word. Bring me the long night of sleeplessness, with mothers mourning their arms bereft of sons. So lines 7 and 8 again are where Jofre makes a surprising and very paradoxical demand, again saying that instead of flowers, he must be brought here long nights of sleeplessness. And look at how those long vowel sounds echo and emphasize the idea of long nights of sleeplessness. And he explains why his people, Angolans, suffering under colonialism, are struggling so much to sleep. It's because mothers are mourning their dead or missing sons. When Rocha describes these mothers' arms as bereft, again he's using a slightly archaic, older English word. Bereft is an adjective that describes sadness or loneliness that is the result of someone dying or leaving, or because something or someone important has gone missing and you're mourning it. So these lines imply that Angolan mothers are mourning because they cannot hold their sons in their arms. Even their arms seem to be mourning because they are empty, which is an example of synecdoche, when a part represents a whole. So here, those empty arms represent all the mothers in Angola, all the parents in Angola who've lost their children. Sons here could refer to freedom fighters, boy children who've been killed or have joined the resistance movement while they are still children and too young to be soldiers, or to the sons that the mothers are unable to conceive because their partners are away fighting. And I think that would be a secondary, less important meaning. But it does refer back to the sexual frustration described in the previous two lines. Notice that although the poem is written in free verse, remember, no definite rhyme scheme, no exact rhythm scheme, it does have quite a regular rhythm because it's structured in these pairs of lines, where each pair of lines has a similar structure and each pair of lines consists of a sentence that is split over two lines using enjambment. You've got similar line lengths and you've got the slow rhythm that is created by the enjambment and those long vowel sounds that I discussed, like mourning and sleeplessness and bereft. Also notice that in lines 1 to 6, the poet has used anaphora. Remember anaphora? The repetition of words at the beginning of lines, where he says, bring me in lines 3 and 5, that emphatic command of what he wants to be brought instead of flowers. And it highlights how insistent the poet is in his desire to share and feel the pain of the Angolan people, and how sad he is that he missed out on that pain. So again, you can see his sense of survivor's guilt, his sense of sorrow at paradoxically having missed out on that terrible pain and mourning because he was away in exile. When I return from the land of exile and silence, no, do not bring me flowers. In lines 9 to 10, Rocha echoes the lines that he wrote in lines 1 and 2, and he repeats his command that when he returns from exile, he must not be given flowers. Note that these lines are almost identical, except that line 10 includes an extra word at the start, no, which emphasizes that the poet is very, very serious about what he's saying. The last thing he wants is to be given flowers or any sort of celebration when he returns, because he's not happy when he returns. He's sad. He's sad at everything that's happened to his people and everything he's missed out on. Can you see how Rocha has used parallel sentences in lines 1 and 2 and lines 9 and 10? Remember that parallel sentences are sentences that are almost identical, so that when there are a few minor changes, those really stand out and are highlighted. And here what's highlighted is the no, which strengthens his point. And then, of course, line 10 ends with those 3 dots. In punctuation, they're known as ellipses, and I always think that they've probably got the soundtrack of dun, dun, da. You know, they haven't literally, but that's what they make me think of, because they imply that there is a pause, there is suspense, that something more is going to happen, or you're going to be given more information. And of course, what you're going to be told is what he does want instead of flowers. Bring me only just this, the last wish of heroes fallen at daybreak. You would have noticed that line 11 is much shorter than all of the other lines in the poem, and that changes the rhythm. All of a sudden it speeds up. And this helps to emphasize the poet's statement that he's not asking for much, particularly as he includes the words only and just, which are obviously synonyms. They mean exactly the same thing. In line 10, the poet explains the only thing he wants when he returns from exile, to share in the last wish that resistance fighters or heroes have as they die, implied by the word fallen. We find out what that last wish is, or we think we do, in the next 2 lines. The word daybreak can be understood literally. The freedom fighters died as the sun rose, which obviously links back to the idea of drama at dawn in lines 5 to 6. Daybreak can also be seen as a symbol or image that stands for a new dawn, metaphorically a positive new life, suggesting that the freedom fighters die just before the independence and freedom that they were fighting for was actually achieved. And note as well that fallen is a euphemism, or a much gentler, more pleasant way of saying die, of saying dying. And there is this idea in that poetic description of heroes fallen at daybreak. It doesn't sound entirely unpleasant. So there is this idea that they are achieving what they ultimately wanted, which was to die for their country. With a wingless stone in hand and a thread of anger snaking from their eyes. So in lines 13 and 14, Jofre describes these freedom fighters as they die. And we find out what Jofre's only wish is when he returns from exile. It is to have the same wish as the freedom fighters had when they died. And he describes the freedom fighters dying with a stone in their hand and their last emotion, which is anger, fading from their dying eyes. Jofre does not actually say what his and the freedom fighters' wish is specifically, but obviously it's implied that their wish is for freedom, independence, and self-rule, because that's what the freedom fighters have fought and presumably died for. And note that Jofre uses the plural, fighters, implying that many have died. And obviously the poet's wish is that when he returns, that he's not celebrated, because all he wants is what the freedom fighters want, which is freedom and self-determination and independence. The fact that he says that he only wants this is ironic, because those are considerably difficult things to obtain, far more difficult to obtain than flowers. People have to die to obtain them. Then have a look at the metaphor of a wingless stone in the dying freedom fighters' hands. This implies that these freedom fighters weren't even properly armed. And even though they weren't properly armed, they continued to fight using whatever they had available, which in this case was only stones that they were going to throw at the Portuguese colonizers. Wings are obviously literally things that are used to fly through the air, and the fact that the stone is described as wingless is because it never flew out of the freedom fighters' hands. the freedom fighters died with their stones in their hands before they could properly attack the colonizers. And it implies that they were unable to fight back. Notice that anger is described as a thread snaking from their eyes. So here we have a metaphor where the dying soldier's last emotion of anger is compared to a thin thread or piece of cotton or string. So this implies that as the soldiers die, their eyes are rapidly drained of all awareness and emotion until just a tiny bit of anger is left, a thin thread of anger. Remember too that thread is used to connect or link things, usually parts of clothing. So it's a good word to use because the soldier's anger is a thread or link that connects them to the poet as they die. His only wish is to pick up on their anger, and their anger becomes a legacy that they leave to the poet so that he can use that anger to fuel his continued fight for Angolan independence. The use of the word snaking is also metaphorical. Here, anger is compared to a snake. And if you think of the connotations of snakes, dangerous, unpredictable creatures, they pop out, they attack you, they go back into hiding. So as the anger is snaked from the dying soldier's eyes, the poet implies that it's gone into others, where like a dangerous snake, anger will hide and wait for an opportunity to strike its enemies, which are obviously in this context the Portuguese colonizers. Obviously, these final lines make the poem both an elegy. Remember, an elegy is a praise poem for the dead. And here, the poet is praising the dead soldiers for their heroism and patriotism, and a protest poem against the injustices of colonization of Angola. But please note, even though this poem has 14 lines, and it deals with the subject of love, love of comrades, love of those who are missing or dead, that does not mean that this is a sonnet. This poem is not a sonnet. Sonnets are traditional romantic love poems, and they have very specific rhyme and rhythm schemes, and this poem does not. Also notice that the poet plays on the word thread, which sounds very similar to the word threat, and that also ties in with the metaphor of anger being like a dangerous snake. And you might have noticed that when I was unpacking these metaphors, I was very methodical and I analyzed them in a step-by-step process that I strongly recommend you follow. So, for example, I explained when I was analyzing the wingless stone and the thread of anger snaking, I followed a 3-step process. Firstly, I said what two things were being compared. So I explained how anger was being compared to a thread. Then I discussed the connotations of the item being used for comparison. So I discussed the connotations of thread. And finally, I explained what was implied by what those things that were being compared had in common. I explained how the description of anger in terms of thread implies things about anger and the effect that the poet achieved in using this metaphor. So if you follow that 3-step process, say what two things are being compared, discuss the connotations of the thing being compared to, and then discuss what's in common and what that implies. If you follow that process when you are discussing metaphors in your tests or exams, you will find them very easy and you will actually collect a lot of marks. In the sample poetry essay question, in Poem of Return, Rocha implies that isolation and the ability to fight with and for his people is the greatest form of suffering. Justify the statement with specific reference to the structure, imagery, and tone of the poem. So in the sample question, I'm just going to give you some suggested answers. Note that there are loads of things you could say in response to this, and these are just a few ideas. Remember that before you start answering a question, you need to understand it. The word structure means the way that a poem is constructed or put together. So when you are talking about structure, you can think about and discuss things like form. For example, is the poem lyrical, a protest poem, a sonnet? The word justify in a question means give evidence to prove that what you are saying is correct. So this is just an example of an answer. In terms of the structure, the poem is written in free verse. It doesn't have a regular rhyme or completely predictable rhythm scheme, and this creates a thoughtful or introspective tone and also heightens the mood of uncertainty and unpredictability. Remember, the tone is the emotional quality of a speaker or writer's words, but mood is how the audience or reader is made to feel. So they are related but not identical. The poet makes a list of things that he would rather receive instead of flowers when he returns from exile. And each item that he asks for example, tears, sexual frustration, mourning for the dead, missing the anger of dying freedom fighters, is deeply unpleasant. And it makes his demands seem quite paradoxical or contradictory and illogical. However, because all of Rocha's demands are linked to a sense of community, you can see that he actually tells a greater truth, and that is that he wants to share his people's pain as they suffer dramas at dawn, the pain of separation from loved ones, and mourning for those that are dead or missing. He describes exile as silence, which compares the sense of activity, life, and community in the suffering that he describes to something that seems to be dead and lifeless and utterly lonely. This rejection of celebration with flowers and all symbols of celebration implies that the isolation of exile is actually far worse than the suffering that the poet would have experienced if he had remained in Angola. The poet's tone of longing to join his people's suffering is particularly reinforced in lines 9 to 12, where the poet says that his only wish is just to share in the dying soldier's last wish. And in lines 13 and 14, he says he wishes that he could have participated and he can continue to participate in the fight for freedom and Angola's independence. He implies that he wishes that he could inherit the thread or threat of anger that comes snaking from the dying soldier's eyes. And remember that the image of a thread implies a connection to a community that he missed out on when he was in exile. And that reinforces the paradoxical nature of the poem. The poet would rather have suffered, even possibly died in his community, than have been safe but isolated in exile. Obviously, there are a lot more points you could have made in response to this question, and I've just given you a few examples. But you would notice that I referenced the structure, the imagery, and the tone in my response. And I would recommend that if you answer a question like this, you look at how the question is stated, because they actually give you a suggested structure, which would be you have an introduction where you turn the question into a statement and you say how you're going to answer it. Then I would do a paragraph on the structure, I would do a paragraph on the imagery, and I would do a paragraph on the tone, and I would link each of those paragraphs back to the idea that isolation and exile is worse than suffering with his people. And then your conclusion is just 2 or 3 sentences where you highlight why your argument is correct. I hope you found that useful. To explain every last item of vocabulary on these slides, I've simply listed the vocabulary that I've used in this presentation, more or less in the order in which it was used. So please just check that you understand each word, make sure that you can spell it correctly, and then I hope that you enjoy using those words when you're talking about this poem and when you're answering questions on other poems, for example, the Unseen poem, and in the language exam. I'll just read the words to you so that you know how they are pronounced. So some useful general vocabulary: exile, colonialism, oppression, plaint, tumid. Remember that those are both examples of archaic language. Survivor's guilt. For vocabulary about structure, you can talk about free verse, protest poem, elegy, sonnet, but please note that this poem isn't a sonnet, even though it does mention love and it has 14 lines in it. Enjambment. Note I've spelt it in the same way as you would in Afrikaans. You can spell it without the second E, but that would be incorrect in Afrikaans, and it seems crazy to learn 2 different spellings of the same word. Parallel sentences, anaphora and repetition, and diction. Remember, diction is choice of words. Useful vocabulary when it comes to figures of speech. Please don't mix these up with parts of speech. Remember, parts of speech are nouns, adjectives, pronouns, etc. Figures of speech are the language techniques that you use to make writing more interesting, and there are hundreds of them. So these are some figures of speech that have been used. So remember that an author can choose between 4 moods of the verb. He can write an imperative sentence when he gives an order or she gives an order, an indicative sentence to convey information, an interrogative sentence to ask a question, or a subjunctive question to suggest a wish or a possibility. Then there is also paradox and contradiction, irony, symbols and symbolism, synecdoche, which is a new one to you probably. It means a part represents a whole. So for example, instead of calling your car, you talk about your wheels, and the wheels represent the whole car. Metaphors, personification, similes, extended metaphors. Mood and tone, remember they're similar but not identical, know the difference. Play on words, anaphora and repetition. Connotations and allusion, not illusion. Illusion is when you think you're seeing something that you actually aren't. Allusion, reference to an outside text, spelt with an A rather than an I. Archaic language, euphemism and synonyms, which are all examples of diction, and then themes and message. And note that some of these are also words that would have come up under structure. So there's not an absolute division between structure and figures of speech. Then phonic devices are language techniques that affect the way that a poem sounds when it's read out loud. Remember, phonos comes from the ancient Greek and it means sound. And although phonic devices can be considered to be figures of speech, when you are asked about them, you are expected to give phonic devices. If you are asked about figures of speech, they are usually after things like synonyms or similes or metaphors or personification, irony, paradox, that kind of thing. If they want a phonic device, they will tell you that they want a sound or phonic device. So the big ones are rhyme, and I've told you can remember the spelling. Rhyme has you and me, so you have R-H-Y-M-E. Rhythm, rhythm has your 2 hips moving, R-H-Y-T-H-M. Alliteration, and there's a specific kind of alliteration we discussed in this poem, which is sibilance, which is when you alliterate that hissing S sound. If you've read Harry Potter, the snake in Harry Potter probably speaks in sibilance. Parseltongue is almost definitely sibilant, because you can imagine this. Assonance and onomatopoeia. Thank you. I hope that you've enjoyed this presentation and found it useful. I have created this channel so that any learner or teacher who is working with the South African NSC curriculum can have access to detailed and hopefully useful teaching and learning materials. And if you'd like to support me in producing these videos, please like and subscribe and pass the link on to any and all of your friends who would find them useful. You're also very welcome to make a small donation to support this work. I don't expect it, but donations are welcome. And if you want to make a donation, please use the PayFast link in the channel description. So please make a point of liking, subscribing, and sharing the link. And I will continue to post videos, so there will always be new material that is hopefully useful to you. Thank you and goodbye.